Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. I originally wanted to talk to Mike Slade about Starwave, that innovative company that launched some of the major names onto the web, including ESPN.com, ABCnews.com, Mr. Showbiz, and others. And after an eventual sale to Disney, put together the pieces that would become the Go.com portal play. But Mike is one of those guys who has had such a varied and interesting career, I couldn't help but go into other areas. I mean, the dude worked at Microsoft in the early 1980s, he worked at NeXT in the early 90s, and from 1998 through 2004, he was special assistant to Steve Jobs as Jobs came in and first saved Apple as a company, but then launched the iPod and kicked into motion the modern gadget era as we know it. So we'll get into all of that in this excellent, wide-ranging conversation with Mike Slade, CEO of Starwave. Mike Slade, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
My pleasure.
So I usually on the show ask questions like, what was it like to go to work at Google in 2000 or Facebook in 2005? But let's start with you by asking, what was it like to go to work for Microsoft in, what was it, 1983?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because I was going to Stanford Business School, and and when I went up there to interview, I didn't really know what they did. At the time, they were private, and Lotus and Ashton Tate were public, and all they mostly made were languages and operating systems and compilers and flight simulator, and Multiplan also ran spreadsheet, and Word hadn't shipped yet, and the Mac hadn't shipped yet, and no one really knew what they were. So I went up there for an interview. I was from the Northwest, and I really wanted to live in the Northwest, and so I interviewed at Nike, and I wasn't a world-class runner, so they didn't hire me, and even though Phil Knight was a Stanford MBA. And then I went to interview at Microsoft, and lo and behold, they made me a job offer, and I took it, and I have to say, I'm not being facetious, I didn't really know what they did when I got there. I mean, I'm not kidding. I didn't really know. People say, what do they do? And I go, software?
So
didn't really know.
Can I intuit from that you maybe weren't like a big-time computer guy at this point?
You know, I wasn't a programmer. I had worked. What had happened to me was I had gone to college. I'd been an economics major, and while I was in college, I was a sports writer for a daily newspaper. First, I was the sports editor of the college paper, and while I worked there, it went digital. So it was one of the first papers in the country to go digital, which meant that I was manipulating the entire AP wire on a screen, a mini computer-based screen, in 1978, helping the sports editor lay the paper out and write stories. So not many people were doing that then, like maybe a few hundred in the whole United States. So the Colorado Springs Gazette was, I think, the 6th paper in the country to go digital. Everybody else had typewriters still and manual typesetting machines. And so I was pretty facile with using a computer, if you will. I wasn't a programmer, but I understood like how to use things like Emacs. And so when I was in Stanford Business School, I was famous because I knew how to write on a computer, they had a mini computer system that everyone used, and so I was the designated paper writer. Everyone loved me because we didn't have to type papers. I could edit them in a word processing program. So I was computer facile, if you know what I mean. And I loved technology and I loved computers, and people liked that, and at Microsoft they liked that. So yeah, when I got there, I was not a programmer, and this guy Pete Higgins, who's now my venture capital business partner, he and I were kind of the first virgin MBAs Microsoft ever hired. You know, guys who weren't technical, hadn't worked in the industry, who just were hired kind of like Procter & Gamble hired product managers.
Oh, wow.
We were the first.
Wow.
So we showed up, in 1983.
Right, and so
Microsoft, 400 people maybe.
Right, so it's still a small company. So this is them maybe trying to grow up and become a big boy company at this point, maybe.
Well, Steve Ballmer was the guy who hired everybody. He was also a Stanford MBA. So, although he had dropped out famously to go to work for Microsoft. So, he was interviewing Stanford MBAs, and the year before, 3 people had been offered jobs, and they'd all turned him down, believe it or not. And so Pete and I were his prizes because we actually said yes. So we came there, and another guy from Wharton came there. We were kind of their first sort of MBA pledge class, like Procter & Gamble and other people have, and General Mills have, they used to have whole groups of MBAs or consulting firms. And we were the only guys in our class who did anything like that. Most people either went to work for, the 300 people in our graduating class at Stanford Business School, and most of them either went to work for consulting firms or investment banks or consumer products companies like Frito-Lay or something. So, or General Mills. Nobody did what we did. So we were considered weird. Another funny thing was that a guy who was one of Pete's best friends, he went to work for Digital Research, which was kind of Microsoft's rival then.
Right.
And they were in Santa Cruz or actually Pacific Grove, which is a suburb of Santa Cruz. And both Pete and I kind of thought that, maybe he'd done better than us because it's such a fun place to live, right? Little did we know they were doomed, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I went there, and the story I like to tell people is I got there on a Friday night of Labor Day weekend, fresh from my honeymoon in Europe. And so it was Friday night of Labor Day weekend, and I had this complicated plan to spend the night at a hotel across the street from Microsoft in Bellevue, and then go to Portland for the weekend where I was from and get organized and come to work after Labor Day weekend ended. So I got to the hotel, which is across the street from the old Microsoft building, at 11:30 on a Friday night of Labor Day weekend, and there was no reservation for me. No one knew who I was, and I was kind of confused. So I didn't really know what to do. I didn't have a credit card. I didn't have any money. And so I went across the street to the Microsoft building that I'd been to one time before, and in the basement there was a phone. And it was one of those phones that rang in the whole building, in the old days, those kinds of phones did. They were called a night bell. So I pick up the phone at 11:30 on Friday night of a Labor Day weekend, and the phone rings like 20 times, and Jeff Rakes, who later was my boss at Microsoft, answers the phone at 11:30 on Friday night of Labor Day weekend. And I go, Jeff, it's Mike. I'm back from my honeymoon, blah, 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 blah. And he interrupts me and he goes, I'm in a meeting. What do you need?
Because they're all working.
And I go, on Friday night of Labor Day at 11:30, and they were about to launch Word 1.0. That's why they were working so hard. And I was like, he was like, just we'll pay you back. Go get the room, get out of here. So I tell my wife, I'm like, we're in big trouble here. People work really hard. So what it was like was a place where people worked really, really, really hard.
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit before we move on to other things. When you still work with startups today, and do you see the same DNA fundamentally in how things worked back then with how things work today, or are there significant differences from era to era that you've been able to see?
Well, it's hard to compare because you couldn't get any work done then unless you came to the office. Remember, there was no internet, and if you were going to connect to a computer remotely, you were going to do it on a 2400 baud modem in 1983, right? So there was no such thing as high-speed connections. Now, Bill Gates, even in those days at Microsoft, had a T1 line to his house, but that's because he was Bill Gates, right? Nobody else did. So if you wanted to do any work, whether it was email or writing something or programming, you had to go to work. You had to be in the office. So it's a really different vibe than now where you can work whenever you want. You can go to Starbucks. Nobody really cares. As long as you get your work done, they don't really care. And so then, people are always on now. They have smartphones and everything. So you just can only imagine. Ballmer and Gates used to walk the halls at night on weeknights to see who was working when. And on Saturdays, Steve would walk the parking lot to see whose car was in the parking lot, see who was working. Mm-hmm. And your bonus was about 50% what you did and 50% how hard you worked. So if you were a complete screw-up but you worked really hard, they gave you a pretty good bonus because you worked hard. Because it was kind of like a factory, right? His whole thing was the software factory. So that was the thing, was that, you were kind of, Microsoft was going to have these tools, and unlike their competitors, they had a really strong approach to their tools philosophy, and they were going to have better tools than anybody else. Their programmers would be more efficient.
So
it's a very strange atmosphere. So I don't know if it's the same now or not. It's kind of hard to compare because people still work really hard, but it's just different. Like you talk to people who work at Amazon here in Seattle, and they say it's a meeting culture and that you got to be there all the time. So that would be similar in some respects. Other companies aren't really like that. When I ran my company, I didn't care when you worked as long as you worked hard.
So when to put a little bit of a bow on the Microsoft era, I'm sure you wore many hats. I see that you worked on Flight Simulator, Excel when Excel launches.
I launched Excel.
Right. So what just in general, what was your main role at Microsoft?
Oh, I was a product marketing guy, and Pete and I, like I said, were kind of the first crop of product marketing guys who were supposed to be kind of in the mold of what people did at General Mills or Procter & Gamble, where we were kind of the bridge between the consumer, sales, and the developers. Because before that, there really wasn't one. And in most companies, there isn't one. And what Microsoft had was a pretty strong, because of Jeff Rakes and Bill's vision, they had a really strong product management organization early on that you were kind of the advocate inside the company to get stuff done and to get resources assigned to your product instead of somebody else's product. And so it was kind of a weird mixture of detail-oriented and sales, internal sales, if you will. And then you were the external ambassador for the product, whatever product that was. So that's all I did. I was a marketing guy. I did Excel, I did Works, I was in charge of all the Mac products. For a while, I had the unenviable job for like 2 years of being kind of Microsoft's ambassador to Apple, because in those days, Windows didn't really exist, or if it did, it was lousy. And so almost all the application sales Microsoft had were either PC, Word, or Mac products. And so, because there really wasn't Windows yet. So like I introduced Office in 1989 in the Mac, and it didn't come out on Windows for 2 more years because there really wasn't a good enough version of Windows, and the Office apps weren't really done right to do it yet. There was no PowerPoint on Windows, et cetera. So it was an important job. It was kind of a funny job because Microsoft and Apple kind of loved and hated each other all at the same time. Apple was suing Microsoft, and yet we had way more revenue off Mac products than PC products, particularly in the U.S. So it's kind of a funny deal. So I was a marketing guy.
Well, I'm sorry, but I can't resist. But so what you're talking about is you're talking about the era, and you're talking about working with applications, and you're talking about the era where Microsoft rises to the top of the application heap, and things like Office become eventually the standard.
And they did that via the Mac. People don't realize that the reason Windows Office and Windows were so successful was because Microsoft got a head start on all of its competitors doing apps for a graphical user interface system because they were so early and so successful on the Mac. So we had this mandate from Bill Gates that we would make $100 in revenue every time a Mac got sold. And Apple used to tell us, we used to exchange secret information with Apple, where we would tell them, they would tell us how many units they shipped that month, and we would tell them how many units of Excel and Word we shipped that month. And this guy at Apple named Matt Cobb, who I went to business school with, he and I would call each other up once a month and have this secret powwow.
And that
how's that?
Yes,
how's that for a while?
Yeah, right. Because the legend is that you guys were always at each other's throats.
Well, that was true also, and Windows certainly bears an eerie similarity to the Mac, right? Mm-hmm. So that's all true. But nonetheless, our futures were intertwined. When I introduced Excel, we were competing with Lotus, and one of the things that was funny about it was that I'm a really nice guy, and by that I mean just compared to most people I know, I'm considered a fun, nice, amiable guy. And the guy at Lotus was a little more standoffish, and so the Apple guys really liked me because I was so nice, and also because they considered the Mac a baby platform, the guys at Lotus, versus 123 and the PC, Lotus 123, which is the preeminent product of the mid 80s. And so what happened was that I would tell people that Excel on a Mac was better than Lotus 123 and a PC, and nobody at Lotus would do that. And so it blew the Apple guys away, and they realized that they had something that they could use, to sell to businesses. One of the other things people forget about this era was that there was very little market for consumers buying PCs and software. It was mostly businesses. I mean, there was people that did hobbyist stuff in their PC, but because there was no, with the exception of like CompuServe and this weird stuff, there really wasn't a reason, or using Quicken to write down all your checks that you wrote. There wasn't much of a reason to use a PC at home. Recipes, games, it was still kind of a hobbyist thing. So mostly what you were doing in those days was selling to businesses, not to consumers.
So you mentioned
almost all.
Right. You mentioned that towards the end, especially, you're basically the main point person with Apple for the Macintosh line. So is it because of that you end up at NeXT at around 1991, I guess?
Kind of. What happened is I was I introduced Excel, and then in between the time we announced it and the time that we shipped it, Steve Jobs was famously deposed by John Sculley at Apple. That's in the summer of 1985, for those of you who care. And so Steve sulked for a while and then went off to start NeXT. And when he started NeXT, he was very secretive about it. And then a couple of years later, when he launched the thing, it didn't work for a while. He started looking for someone good to run marketing because he had lousy marketing. So he tried to hire me a bunch of times because he knew I'd done such a good job on Excel. And I only met him a couple of times to run marketing at NeXT. And I turned him down a couple of times, and then finally I left and did it. So I kind of did it. You know, when I was at Microsoft, I went from 400 people to 8,000, 8,500 people, and most people thought it was great and wanted to stay there forever. And I didn't really like it that much. I mean, it was kind of like, you know, people were sort of aggressively negative about each other. It was really political. It seemed like a big company to me. I wanted to be in a smaller environment. So I was kind of happy to leave. And so what I did was I went to work for Steve as kind of a bigger fish in a smaller pond, if you will, which was really fun. I'm really glad I did it. And we became really good friends because NeXT was in trouble and trying to figure out what to do. And, you know, he and I just thought the same way. So it was really a fun deal. I'm glad I did it. It was an odd thing to do. People at Microsoft just thought I was weird. No one was leaving Microsoft in those days, but it wasn't really for me. Its environment was just different than kind of the way I'm cut. So I did that. And then later, after I ran my internet company and sold it, I went to work for Steve again. Yeah, when he was back turning it out. But we'll get to that.
I'll touch on that towards the end. I just want to. I saw on your LinkedIn profile the only thing you have for NeXT is you say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So like as it's a struggle, right? But it was more fun, is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, you know, nothing wrong with a Dickens quote in there, but yeah. So I mean, the thing is that we were a small company competing with both Microsoft and Sun and also PC companies because we were selling expensive workstations to big companies and to education and stuff. So you were in kind of the major leagues, but we were kind of the smallest company in that environment. So it was kind of a mixed bag in terms of, you know, what resources you had and how much scale you could get to and all that stuff. So if I felt underemployed at Microsoft, I felt overemployed at NeXT. Let's put it that way. You know, the first month I was in meetings with Michael Dell and Andy Grove of Intel. You know, Steve would just drag me everywhere. You know, I did everything with Steve, and so I got to do great things. However, NeXT was almost out of money like 5 times. It was really a crazy time, and a lot of decisions. Some decisions that Steve made were terrible. You know, there's a really good book about the Steve Jobs at NeXT called Becoming Steve Jobs, which was written by Brent Schlender, which I highly recommend for people because it's, in addition to having fabulous quotes from me and Bill Gates all over it, it's just really accurate. You know, Brent Schlender knew Steve really well, and the Walter Isaacson book, which everyone kind of read and they made that shitty movie out of, doesn't really talk about how and why Steve changed. It's more of a breathless highlight film. And so if you want to understand Steve, what was going on with them, it's better to read that book. That's a really good book.
I highly
very personal.
Highly recommend that one also over the Isaacson book.
And I mean, in Walter's defense, it's hard to write a book when a guy's dying and you're talking to him all the time. So he didn't do anything wrong. It's just hard to get it right. You know?
So I believe that you're at NeXT from like 91 and 93. So I'm trying
about 2 years.
Right. So I wanted.
Here's what happened.
Sure.
They were about to go out of the hardware business. They, for various reasons, their chip strategy they got kind of screwed over by Apple and IBM forming an alliance, and so they had to eventually get out of the hardware business. And when I left NeXT to go back to Seattle, I told Steve this was going to happen. And I also told him that the guy he had hired to be the COO at NeXT, who was a guy named Peter Van Kuylenburg, was kind of bad news, that he was lying to Steve and lying to us and that it wasn't going to end well. And Steve was really mad at me. And then within 3 months, I told him like 5 things, and all of them came true within like 3 months, just as it happened, not because I'm a genius. And so it was kind of amazing that this happened. And so he did something he probably never done in his whole life, but he called me up and apologized, which was a landmark moment. And so he apologized to me, and it kind of, even though I'd already left, come back to Seattle, it kind of cemented our friendship in this weird way because I had told him all this stuff not out of spite or malice, which is what he thought, just because it was true. And so that really changed our friendship in a major way. And he became a smallish software company that sold tools to big companies. And then when the internet came along, they sold some tools to enable e-commerce, and then eventually Apple bought them.
There really is no quick fix for anxiety and depression. There are things like therapy, regular meditation, or just exercising more, but sometimes you need something to unlock your brain, a new way of thinking about and seeing the world. Maybe that thing is guided ketamine therapy from MindBloom. There's a new tool to improve your mental health, at-home ketamine therapy. MindBloom is the leader in at-home ketamine therapy, having safely helped thousands of people overcome their anxiety and depression. Unlike traditional talk therapy, ketamine works quickly and doesn't have the unpleasant side effects of traditional antidepressants. In a study of over 1,200 MindBloom clients, 89% reported improvements in their anxiety and depression after only 2 sessions. Right now, MindBloom is offering our listeners $100 off your first 6-session program when you sign up at mindbloom.com/techmeme and use promo code Techmeme. Take the first step and break free from your anxiety and depression with MindBloom. Mindbloom.com/Techmeme and use promo code Techmeme. I got lucky. I stumbled into the career that I love, but accidentally. I wanted to be a film director, and instead I became a startup founder. If you're a software engineer and you're looking to make an impact, maybe you should do what I did and consider looking beyond the obvious path. Bloomberg is building the world's most trusted information network for financial professionals, and they're looking for engineers to join them. I've never worked at Bloomberg personally, but there's no business or financial news source I trust more for this show. But also, think about it. At its core, Bloomberg is one of the world's preeminent data and technology companies already. At Bloomberg, you'll devise solutions and systems that solve complex real-world problems for customers across global capital markets. You'll be part of a team that builds and delivers tools to help the world's leading businesses and finance decision makers surface relevant information in an ever-expanding ocean of data and act on it quickly. The majority of Bloomberg's software is built on C++, JavaScript, TypeScript, and Python, and Bloomberg engineers are active members of the open source community, both contributing to and leveraging open source software in their products. Working at Bloomberg means operating at insane scale. The company's real-time market data feeds ingest and process more than 30 billion, yes with a B, market data messages daily. Learn more about the opportunities that await you by visiting Bloomberg.com/careers. That's Bloomberg.com/careers.
So
I hope, if time permitting, that we will come back to that Apple story.
Yeah, I will definitely come back. I know a lot about it.
So I was framing the year 1993-ish because we're going to get into Starwave here, but I should point out that in 1993 the web exists, but it isn't a thing yet. So if you could,
it doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists. So I knew about it because the guy Tim Berners-Lee, who basically invented the World Wide Web, he invented it on NeXT machines at this research institute in Switzerland. So we all knew about it, and NeXT had lots of educational customers. To give you a perspective on it, in 1991, when I left Microsoft to go to work for NeXT, I got a business card that said VP of Marketing on it, and it said Mike Slade. It had the address, it had the fax number, it had the mailing address, and then it said Mike Slade at next.com. And I was like, what is this @ sign? I'd never seen it before. And no business cards in the world had those on it, but because NeXT had educational customers, everybody emailed each other inside and outside of the company. So at Microsoft in 1990 and 1991, you couldn't email people unless they worked at Microsoft.
Right, because they didn't want, they were afraid of viruses and things like that, so they didn't want an outside connection?
No, there was just simply wasn't done.
It was just
like
intranet.
It'd be like having a sat phone or calling the moon. It just wasn't done. It didn't occur to anybody. Nobody did at any company. So I was like, wow, this is really internet-y. And we had an FTP program for downloading pictures. And I got there and a guy showed me how to download dirty pictures on my NeXT machine in black and white. And I'm like, how are you doing that? And he was using this thing called Gopher to connect to the University of Minnesota server. And I'm like, really? You're talking to a computer at a different place? How are you doing that? Like, It just didn't occur to people unless it was some big corporate network, where you connected buildings or something. So NeXT is where we all learned about the notion of two computers talking to each other in different companies or different places, if you will, right? Not inside of a corporate network. Mm-hmm. So when I left NeXT and came back to work for Paul Allen, this was when AOL was starting to get really big and when CompuServe and Prodigy were starting to fade because AOL was a lot more easy to use than those services were. They were pretty geeky and text-based. So Paul Allen, who had been a co-founder of Microsoft and who I had gotten to know because he bought my beloved Portland Trailblazers, he had this idea in 1993 called the wired world. And he said the world was going to be connected someday, which was correct, and that we should do something about it. And so he tried to buy AOL. He almost bought it, and then he backed off. He owned 26% of it at one point, and then he sold it. He was a billionaire back when there weren't many billionaires. I mean, there really weren't many billionaires at all. Right? Now there are lots of them.
Right.
And he said to me, you come work for me in Seattle, and we can look at cool stuff that is on this general theme of a multimedia wired world, which would be the internet today, but nobody knew that then.
Well, because this was also this was the era of everyone trying interactive TV, and the information superhighway is the next big thing.
Yeah, I'll get to that. That's exactly right. And so he said all that, and he said, why don't you find something? If you find something you're excited about and I'm excited about, you run it and I'll fund it. I'll give you some upside. So I shook his hand and moved to Seattle. No contract, nothing. So as you point out, in early 1993, Sun and Silicon Graphics and Microsoft and all these other people were screwing around with what was called interactive TV. And there was this trial that was going on in Orlando, Florida, where Time Warner had a cable system there, and they were going to do this really fancy schmancy interactive TV trial. And SGI beat out Sun for the right to do it and to waste money doing it.
Full Service Network.
Exactly, and it was a disaster. It was just, and all the demos where, you're sitting on your TV watching a show, and then you click on the jeans and buy them, or, a phone call comes in. A lot of the scenarios are actually the scenarios you see in Back to the Future 2. If you watch, it's a shitty movie, but if you watch Back to the Future 2, a lot of these scenarios are in that movie of like phone calls on your TV and stuff like that. And they got it completely wrong, because everybody thought that TV was where it was at, even though the TV is a closed system, doesn't have a keyboard, et cetera, and your computer is a very versatile system, right? So everybody got it wrong, but never mind that. So while they all got it wrong, people were screwing around with the internet. And so I didn't really know whether AOL would be the most popular service. Microsoft was going to introduce a competitor to it called MSN, or whether the web would be popular or whatever. No one really thought the internet would be popular because it needed a high-speed connection, and you had a 14.4 modem maybe, and it needed a TCP/IP stack on your computer, and Windows didn't have that. You had to go download it separately, et cetera. But I sat in this room with Paul, and I said, regardless of platform, here are 10 ideas. And we brainstormed all day long. Some were his ideas, some were mine. And of the 10 ideas, 9 were marginal or obvious, and 1 was really good. And the one that was really good was doing the world's biggest sports section. Because I'd been a sports writer, he was a sports nut. I would argue I'm even more of a sports nut than he is, but it's close. And so he loved that idea, and we did a bunch of things at Starwave. We did CD-ROM titles, which are kind of like websites before there were websites delivered on a disc, with Clint Eastwood, with Peter Gabriel, with Sting, with the Muppets. We did some interactive TV prototyping, and we did a whole bunch of online service prototypes. We did a sports one, we did a news service one, an entertainment one, a family one. And the sports one was obviously the cool one. And over time, we spent all of our energy and all of our time on this thing. And so we built a team of about 150 people in 1993 and 1994, building all the back-end stuff to deliver a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week interactive sports service. And so that meant writing your own publishing system, writing your own web server, writing your own ad server, writing your own multimedia server, video server. We did all the stuff that no one had ever done before. We parsed news feeds. No one had ever done that before. And at the same time, because I was working for a billionaire, we weren't going to run out of money. And so I went to Sports Illustrated and ESPN, and I said, you guys should partner with us because we have all these resources. I'm building a great development team and a great engineering team, and we're not evil big companies that will screw you like, say, Microsoft. We're just little great guys, and I'm a great guy. And after like 2 years of selling, ESPN agreed to partner with us.
So you approached them, they didn't come to you?
We approached them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we approached them and Sports Illustrated. Guess who ran the interactive group at Time Inc.? Walter Isaacson. Mm-hmm. And what did he say? He said, we're doing our own thing. So I said, okay.
Pathfinder, yeah.
The Pathfinder, exactly. So anyway, so what happened is that after, like I said, 2 years of selling and the internet starting to get going and these other things starting to fall by the wayside, in October of 94, we launched a prototype news sports service called Satchel Sports, named after Satchel Paige. And that it was so good and it impressed ESPN so much that it accelerated the negotiations. We did it without them. We did it ourselves. And so then we finally got this deal done with them in February or January. I had to convince Paul to guarantee him a bunch of money. And then in April of 1995, the NCAA Final Four was in Seattle. It was the year that UCLA won the NCAA tournament with the O'Bannon brothers, who were later famous for suing for merchandise rights. But anyway, and so we launched that weekend at the Kingdome in Seattle, and it was an instant hit. It was #1 the minute it launched. It was a big deal. We had video highlights up on the internet in April of 1995, but the whole thing was amazing. And so it was just a huge hit. And from the moment it was a huge hit, it was obvious that we were going to be in bed with ESPN for a long time. And so in short order, we launched a deal to do the NBA's website together with ESPN and the NBA, the NFL, NASCAR. And then Disney bought ESPN's parent company, Cap Cities. And once they bought them, we became extremely strategic because Cap Cities had been one of those companies that didn't want to spend any money on this stuff. They wanted somebody else to spend the money. So they let us own and operate the service with their brand. Disney thought that was stupid and wanted to do it the other way around. It was like a joint venture or they bought us or whatever. And so once Disney bought them, we spent probably 30 months in various levels of negotiation with Disney, which ended with them buying us. But it took a long time. I spent a lot of time at Disney.
Can we go into some of the details of this here? I've spoken to people like Mark Levy of Sportsline, and also people.
Yeah, not Mark. What's his name?
Mike.
Mark
Mike.
Levy.
Sorry, Mike. I apologize.
Sure. Right.
But people that started at Hotwired and Slate and things like that, and so I'm curious about the idea of the web is an always-on 24/7 information medium. Do you guys launch with like live sports scores, or is that something that you adapt over time? Like, I'm curious.
We launched with live. We totally launched live. So what we did was, in 1993, we launched. Sorry, in 1993, both Microsoft and other people had done these CD-ROM titles that had this feature where you could connect via a modem and do a periodic update of the stats. So they launched things that were kind of like encyclopedias, right? And then you could get an update. So what we did was we licensed the sports ticker feed, which was used then to like scroll scores across stadiums and stuff, right? And it was owned by ESPN actually. And we licensed it, and we had this genius guy who had a PhD in linguistics who parsed it. And it wasn't designed to be parsed. It was like gobbledygook. But he figured out how to parse it all the time. That is, the feed would come by and he could turn it into like a browsable database that said like, today's Friday. Friday, NFL, scores, recap, box score, all that. Friday, MLB, AL, Mariners, right? And we wrote this visual basic prototype to take his server work and display it, and it blew everyone away. And the sports ticker guy said, no one's ever done that before. We didn't even know you could do that. So we were really the first guys to ever do it, right? This was like a year and a half before we launched. And so then we really knew we had something when we did that. So, no, this was always on, always real time. The April 1st, 1995 version of ESPNSportZone.com it's surprisingly similar to the version today. Of course, it's better today in a million ways, right? And it's got tons of video and tons of other great things. But the basic meat and potatoes of the scoreboards and the recaps and the stats is exactly the same.
So right, and so getting more into the weeds about this, from what I've read from articles at the time, this is before the era of things like content management systems. But you guys,
we wrote our own.
I feel like you guys had to pioneer a lot of that stuff.
We wrote everything. We literally wrote everything because not because we wanted to, we had no choice. We wrote a content management system. We wrote an internal publishing system that was basically like a version of Word that ran on a server, right? That let you edit, italicize, format. We had a system for tagging photos from the various Wise services. We wrote our own video stuff. We wrote our own ads server. There were no ad servers. We had to measure the ads, right? There weren't many ads. Literally everything that you need today that a lot of times now you can just get from shareware, we had to write from scratch.
And what about
insane?
What about the ads, though? So you guys are designing the sites for someone like ESPN or eventually abcnews.com and stuff like that. And you're designing the site. You're functionally running the site. Are you also doing the ad sales and things like that?
So what happened is, in 1995, as we were about to become a business, we had no idea what the business model would be. I mean, no one did, right? I'm not saying we didn't. Literally, no one did. No one knew either A, how big the internet was going to be, or B, what form of revenue would eventually accrue to you, if any. So the three choices were you could make money off ads, which seemed unlikely. You could make money off people paying a subscription, which seemed more likely, frankly, back then. Or you could make money off merchandise or other kind of things. And so Paul Allen ordered me to have all three kinds of revenue streams done by September 30th, 1995. So when we launched in April, and this was a web service, there was no AOL version, it was just an internet website, we had ads. We sold Gatorade, an ad package at launch for $30,000 a month. And they said, what do we get for $30,000? And we said, everything. So literally, the entire site was just a Gatorade banner, one big banner after another.
Right, because it's not CPM. It's just you're just sponsoring the whole thing.
Well, it kind of was, and we did measure it, but no one knew, right? So, and then by fall, we had spun up a store to sell merchandise like college jerseys and ESPN stuff, and we had also done two premium services. One was we launched what is now the insider portion of ESPN.com, the portion of the site that you pay $40 or $50 a month for, that's premium content. And then it was some AP stuff they wouldn't give away and some video, some better photos and some columnists and stuff. It's kind of like what it is now, actually. And then we also launched the first fantasy football in the fall of 1995. We had 4,000 people who paid us $40. So we invented fantasy football on the internet.
It's so funny how much that comes up in the sports sites about how fantasy was so tied to sports going on the web. But it makes sense because it's such a clear, easy revenue stream.
No, 4,000 people. It was tiny because we charged for it, and we barely worked because it was a really complicated software problem. And then we also so we launched all three of those things by September because Paul ordered us to, because he didn't really understand. He was worried that we wouldn't have any revenue. So we built our own e-commerce system, everything. A guy left. He took the password to the server with him and threatened to spill. It was terrible, right? But it was fascinating. So we invented all this stuff.
So you said that almost as soon as you launch, it's wildly successful, and I think you'll find I found this quote from an article in '96, sort of amusing, where they say, Sports Zone's numbers are staggering. It averages 7.5 million hits a day. And that sounds small today, but it really would have been staggering for 1996.
So like when it launched, there was a Spark station, which, seemed like a mainframe, right, on the CTO's desk, and that's what it was on. It wasn't in a data room. It wasn't in a server room in some offsite thing. It certainly wasn't on the cloud. There was no cloud. It was on a guy's Spark station. And then it got maxed out. We put more RAM in the Spark station. We put a second processor in it, and it got maxed out. So we wrote software to load balance between servers in 1995. Okay. Like that would have been a multi-billion-dollar business if we spun it out, right? So because we had no choice, right? So yeah, all that stuff was literally, and our strategy was pretty funny. And both the guy from ESPN, Dick Glover, and I would say the same thing all the time. We would just say our strategy is to get out ahead and run like hell. That's all we did. That's literally all we did.
How close in partnership were you with ESPN? Like, are you working with their reporters? Are you getting content from them, and vice versa? Are they promoting you?
Yeah. So when we launched, we had 150 people working on the site, and they had 3. And it wasn't because they were bad guys; it's because they just didn't have any budget, right? So then we started sending people there, and they started sending, we called them prisoner exchanges, and they started sending people to Seattle, right? And what happened is, as it got more successful, it got people at ESPN more excited about it. But the funniest thing is, so it was a very complicated negotiation because we didn't know what the business was going to be. And so we were guaranteeing a bunch of money, and Paul Allen, even though he was a billionaire, was pissed about it. He said, why are we guaranteeing all this money? So what we gave them was, we did all the work, if you will, right? With a few exceptions. We did all the technical work, and the entire reporting staff was in Seattle originally. Later on, it changed, and everything happened in Seattle, unless it was wire stuff that we just parsed and dressed up with headlines. But then what happened is, they said that in exchange for guaranteeing us $2.5 million a year, which is what we did for 5 years, they would promote it with television advertising, which would be worth X. And so we were the first guys to ever do a deal where you got, internet technology in exchange for TV promotion. We started doing that. And they said, here's the number of ads we'll run, here's where we'll run them, here's the rate card, here's a discount, blah, blah, blah. So you could do the math and figure out that it was allegedly worth it, right? Then they said, oh, we'll do one more thing. We are starting to do this thing. They had this thing then called 2858. So you know how now when you watch ESPN, the bottom portion of the screen is a scoreboard that scrolls across, right? Mm-hmm. It's a horizontal
right. The ticker.
Right, the ticker. So the ticker then appeared twice an hour, at 28 minutes after and 58 minutes after. For 2 minutes, then it went away because people were afraid of cluttering up the screen, which seems laughable now, right? It's true. So what they said was, oh, guess what we're going to do for you? When we run the 2858s, we're going to put, in addition to the scores that say San Diego 3, Seattle 2, we're going to say http://espnnet.sportzone.com. Go online to see the best or whatever during those 2 times an hour. And we said, what the fuck is that? And Paul said, you should value that at 0. And that single-handedly made the business. So we invented, I should say they invented the idea of actual promotion of website URLs. That was the first time it had ever been done anywhere. Was that concession they gave us in the negotiation, which we decided was worth 0, and we're completely wrong about. It was worth a fortune, right?
It's always real estate.
We were the first people to ever do it. And it wasn't an ad. It was during content, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a huge deal, and they invented it. It was their idea. It was just absolutely brilliant. Changed everything. Literally changed everything. And that was all them.
So
anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just saying, it's funny how we didn't even know how to value it, much less that it was worth a lot. And I was like saying to Paul, this could be kind of cool. And he was like, yeah, but what's it worth? Who knows? And he was right. How would you know, right?
Mm-hmm. Looking for a better way to simplify your business finances across expenses, vendor payments, even accounting? If so, Ramp could be a complete game changer for you. Ramp is the corporate card and expense management software designed to help you save time and put money back in your pocket. Ramp gives finance teams unprecedented control and insight into company spend. With Ramp, you're able to issue cards to every employee with limits and restrictions and automate expense reporting so you can stop wasting time at the end of every month. Ramp's accounting software automatically collects receipts and categorizes your expenses in real time, so you don't have to. Ramp is easy to use. Get started, issue virtual and physical cards, and start making payments in less than 15 minutes, whether you have 5 employees or 5,000. And Ramp saves you money. Businesses that use Ramp save an average of 3.5% the first year. And now you can get $250 when you join Ramp. Just go to ramp.com/techmeme. Ramp.com/techmeme. That's RAMP.com/techmeme. All this week, I'm going to be telling you about Miro. At first glance, Miro might seem like just another simple digital whiteboard, but Miro's capabilities run far beyond that. It's a visual collaboration tool where the whole team can build on each other's ideas and create something innovative together from anywhere. Think of Miro as your team's visual platform to connect, collaborate, and create together, even if you're not actually together. In the office, remote, or a mix of the two, with Miro, your team can connect, collaborate, and co-create all in one space, no matter where you are. Strategic planning becomes easier when it's visual and accessible. Tap into a way to map processes, systems, and plans with the whole team so they not only view it, but have a chance to give feedback. And with over 100 integrations, it works where you already work, whether you want to edit your Google Docs, resolve Jira issues, or collaborate over Zoom. Empower your entire team to take ideas from better to best with Miro. Sign up today at Miro.com/podcast, and if you use that link, your first 3 Miro boards are free forever when you sign up. That's Miro, Miro.com/podcast. So Starwave develops a bunch of different things. Like there's, like I said, abcnews.com, but then there was also... you did NBA. There was a Mr. Showbiz, which sort of was like the first, entertainment news sort of site on the web and things like that.
Yeah, that's right.
And but was always the ESPN site that was always for you guys the big kahuna, right?
Our plan was to have a whole bunch of businesses like ESPN.com with different partners. Mr. Showbiz, we thought we'd launch on our own, and then someone would partner with us. We'd get a TV show for it. We came very close to doing a deal with Dow Jones for WallStreetJournal.com, like I would say to the 10-yard line, and then it didn't. Then it went away. I tried to get CNN to do a deal with us, but they didn't like the fact we were in business with ESPN. I tried to get ABC to do a deal with us, and they didn't. They just were hesitant. And then once Disney bought them, everything kind of changed. And so once Disney bought the company, we were strategic. The guys at Disney were kind of driving the bus on the strategy. This guy, Jake Weinbaum, who was a brilliant guy, he and I and Tom Staggs and Kevin Mayer ended up being sort of the kitchen cabinet of Disney's internet strategy. And so even though I didn't work for Disney, I was there helping them figure out what to do. So we built in 1997, when Disney owned part of us, but not all of us, or maybe it was, 1996 when they didn't own any of us yet. We built abcnews.com on spec. We built it on spec, like a spec house. And I went to this ABC annual retreat at the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix, and I showed it to them. And we built it just purely on spec. We had no contract, no handshake, nothing. And we blew them away. They were like, oh, my God. And what's funny is the person who was the most blown away was the president of Disney, who was named Michael Ovitz. He hadn't been fired yet. Mm-hmm. He came up to me like, oh, my God, this is fabulous. So eventually they did this deal in early 1997 to buy part of us with an avenue to eventually buy the rest of us. Once that happened, our strategy and their strategy kind of became the same strategy, which was to de-emphasize the stuff we were already doing that wasn't sports, get ABC News going, and then eventually build a portal, which we did together called Go.com.
Right. So how does there's this convoluted, you don't have to explain it, but somehow InfoSeek's involved, and then... So
this is a great story. So What happened is that, Disney bought 3/8 of Starwave. And some of that money went to Paul Allen, and some of it went to the employees, but most of it went to the company. Some went to Paul, some went to the company. And the company was still losing money, but it was plugging along. And Disney had board control, even though they only had 3/8 of the company. And then they had an option to buy the rest of the company. And the way Paul structured the deal was, in the first 2 years, the option had a cap. And after that, it was just at fair market value of whatever the asset was worth, which was supposed to worry them because the internet stocks were going up so much, right? And so they were incented to buy it early. So what happened is, we were in this state in 1997 and part of 1998. We were kind of like an Iron Curtain country, right? We were like Czechoslovakia or something. We were partly owned by Disney. The employees didn't have any liquidity, but they kind of called the shots. But they couldn't tell us what to do because we had other shareholders. It was kind of a mess. And I was the chairman, so it was kind of a messy job. Like Michael Eisner called me at one time and told me to build an Angels website for the Angels because Disney owned the Angels. And I was like, well, but you don't want to pay me for it. He goes, no, I just paid to buy the company. And I'm like, well, you don't own the company. I got other shareholders. Fuck you. He got all mad. So anyway, what happened is and they wanted to build this big portal, and we were doing all this great work on the portal. And I said, look, the problem is you're going to lose all the good guys unless you give them some liquidity, because all these other companies have gone public. And so all their competitors are making money and they aren't, So, and they know what the cap is on buying it, so they're just going to leave. So they just said, well, we'll just buy the company fine. So they're going to buy the company, and it was going to be an okay outcome for everybody. It was going to value Starwave at about $350 million. So then what happened is, this guy, Tom Staggs, who later became the COO of Walt Disney and is a really smart guy, we were kind of in talks with all these guys who weren't Yahoo, Excite, InfoSeek, Lycos, CNET, all these guys who were kind of also getting in the portal business, because it was pretty obvious that Yahoo was the king, and Google didn't exist yet. Google actually didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So what happened is that of all the companies, they liked InfoSeek the best, probably because they were cheapest. The stock was the cheapest. So what Tom Staggs did was he made an offer to Paul Allen to buy his shares out at that capped price of $350 million. And so for about a minute, he owned most of Starwave, but not the employees' shares. So he owned about 85 or 90% of Starwave, but not my stock and not the rest of my employee stock, which was like 400 people. Then he took that asset and traded it for half of InfoSeek, and in between buying it and selling it, he marked it up 3x. So he took the $300 and something million worth of Starwave that he owned, told InfoSeek it was worth $1 billion, and InfoSeek said okay, and they bought half of InfoSeek with it. So we, the employees, suddenly got a whole bunch of InfoSeek stock that valued our stake at $1 billion. So the good news was he bought half of InfoSeek for cheap, if you will, and took us along for the ride. So it was all great. The problem was he then owned not quite half of InfoSeek and couldn't get them to do what he wanted to do. And during that year of screwing around with InfoSeek before they bought the rest of it, it cost them a lot of time because it was really cumbersome. And that's when I left, and a lot of good people left because it was just kind of a disaster.
Right, because that's
great for us, but they should have just bought the whole thing or something. Because I'm glad he did it. Don't get me wrong, it was wonderful. But he ended up not. They had to. Everything was a big negotiation, and the InfoSeek guys had figured out that the only way to get them off the dime was to buy all of InfoSeek, which they wanted to do anyway. They wanted to get sold.
So right, that was the whole Go.com thing and everything, which
which took too long. And then what happened is they put Bornstein in charge of it, and there was this thing where Eisner told me he wanted me to run it, and then he denied it, and I was pissed off, and Bornstein didn't even really want to do it. He was pissed off, and it was a mess. It was a classic Disney mess. So I left, and I stayed around consulting for a while, and then I left, and Steve had wanted me to come run marketing for Apple. He went back to Apple. I talked to him a lot about going back to Apple. We were pretty good friends. And
this is 98, basically.
This is 97.
90,
okay. He wants me to come. 97, he goes, come run all of marketing for Apple. And I'm like, I can't. I'm in this thing with Disney. I have an employment contract. I kind of knew I had to go through this 18-month process to get it sold. So when we finally sell it, he goes, I go, look, I can't work there full time. I got kids and everything, but I can work there part time. And he goes, great. So he hired me in 98 to be a part-time advisor to him on this executive team. So for 6 years, from 98 to 04, I commuted there every Monday and Tuesday and spent 2 whole days doing everything Steve did. Every meeting you went to, the executive staff meeting, design meetings, product meetings, advertising meetings.
We might need to do another episode. In fact, we definitely do if you'll be willing. Sure. Because I don't want to take up your whole afternoon, and also I haven't researched this era enough, but let me ask you just a couple questions about that era of 98 to 2004 Apple.
Sure.
Number one, history would say, oh, Steve comes back to Apple and turns it all around and everything is great, but it always occurred to me that, he was gone
for a long time.
I was going to say, this question specifically, because he had been gone for basically a generation of Apple employees. So when Steve...
Yeah, 11 years.
Right. So when Steve comes back, yeah. I'm sure there were some long-timers that were still there from when he was there at the first time. But when he comes back, was there a lot of pushback and politics? And it couldn't have been that everyone was on board with everything Steve wanted to do when he came back, right?
So when Steve came back, first he consulted for a while, and then they fired Gil Amelio, who was kind of a bozo. And so then they asked him to be the interim CEO. And the board made the mistake of asking him. And because they asked him, he said, I'll only do it under these conditions. So the first condition was, he said, get rid of the board. This board sucks. And he hand-picked a new board. The second condition was, he said, I get to fire anybody I want. And so when I got there, he said to me, look, here's my job at Apple. Half the people here are good. Half the people are bozos. I have to keep enough of the good ones and get rid of the bozos as fast as I can. So, but it was easier than you think, because the head of hardware and the head of software and the head of legal were all from NeXT. So even though Apple bought NeXT, really NeXT kind of bought Apple, because Avi Tabanian had been at NeXT forever. John Rubinstein had been the head of hardware at NeXT. Those guys came to Apple actually before Steve came back. They came back as soon as NeXT got bought by Apple. And so he had people, and Sina Tamadin, who ran all the apps group, also worked at NeXT. And so when I got there, of the 9 people in the executive staff meeting, 5 of us had worked at NeXT, on the executive staff at NeXT. So that's why it was easier for him than you might have think, because it's like going on a date with your old girlfriend. You already know what she wants for dinner. You know everything. Right?
Well,
we're all buddies.
It's like a coup almost. You guys took over Apple.
Yeah, absolutely a coup. It was kind of by accident. So what happened is, when Apple bought NeXT and Emilio was in charge, Avi was at NeXT, and then Steve kind of arranged for Rubinstein to go back to Apple. And so he had 2 of his trusted guys running hardware and software, the 2 most important jobs, right? And so then he heard from them what a bozo Emilio was. He fell asleep in his own staff meeting, was spending millions of dollars building a new bathroom for his office, stupid stuff, right? So anyway, you kind of knew what was going to happen, right? But when he came back, what was easier about it was that he had people he already kind of got, as opposed to people he didn't trust in key positions. So, and then he had this guy, one of the unsung heroes of the Apple turnaround is the CFO, Fred Anderson. Fred Anderson was a great guy who Steve hadn't met before, but they loved each other. The guy was a great guy. He was key to running all the stuff Steve didn't want to be bothered with. And he did a great job. It's a long story, obviously, but that's one of the things people don't really realize is that he had 3 of his trusted lieutenants he'd worked with at NeXT, so he knew them well.
When I research this era more, maybe you'll come back. But one other question about that era relates to so this is this legendary turnaround of a company that's on the brink of death, and then now is the greatest success of our modern tech era. How much of that, when you're there in this era, is it because the web was happening, it's blowing a hole in the tech industry wide open, and so is that era, is there almost like there's a space created that Apple can sort of find its niche and start to do things like this hub strategy and things like that? Was how much do you think was that era and the web happening allowing Apple to have that breathing room to eventually resuscitate itself and succeed?
Well, it's a good question. I think it helped because if you think about it, once the internet got popular in 95, 96, 97, 98, if you were observant, even if you didn't have any research, you'd figure out that, geez, I'm spending a lot of my time just looking at a web browser and doing email, right? Not using Word or Excel or PowerPoint or whatever, or Adobe Illustrator or something, right? Or Quicken. I'm spending, if you did a time and motion study, right? You were spending more than half your day just looking at the browser and your email, right, or chat or whatever. So if you're doing that, it doesn't really matter what you're doing it on, right? The whole advantage of Windows, thousands of applications, most of which were business-oriented applications or games, was kind of irrelevant, right? So that helped, but it wouldn't have mattered if Apple hadn't built good stuff, right? And even so, their market share of PCs was like 2%. And then maybe it got to 4%. And I remember I had this conversation with Steve one time where I was like, look, we're so small that we could double in sales and probably people wouldn't even notice, right? Because I said, it's kind of an advantage because our share is so small, right? And it was really small. I mean, if PC sold, Macs were maybe a couple points, and maybe they doubled it at some point. And then the big thing is the iPod, right? I mean, the iPod is the thing that really changed Apple because people had permission to buy an Apple product without having to give up a Windows, right?
Right.
And that was a really big deal, even though it was originally a Mac-only product. That was a really big deal.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me because remember, originally when you read those articles about the iPod launch, it's like, well, and even I think Steve says this, well, this is going to encourage people to buy Macs. But
No, it was a big fight. There were two things about it. One was that it required FireWire. There was no USB 2.0 yet. And because it required FireWire, all Macs had FireWire, and some PCs had it. Sony PCs had it, and then other PCs only had it if you got an external card and installed it. So it was very difficult to use an iPod on Windows until USB 2.0, which was like 3 years later. So at first, it was for Macs and geeks, basically, right? Unless someone bought it for you and loaded it up for you. Because remember, what you were doing was there was no store. So for the first 3 years of the iPod until late 2003, the only way you could use it, or 2 years, let's say, was to take your own music, copy it off CDs, legally or illegally, get music, and then sideload it from iTunes onto your iPod, right? That's the only way you could do it. There's no store.
Right.
So it seems pretty hard today. It didn't seem that hard then, but it seems pretty hard, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that was in the days when people made mix CDs, rip, mix, burn. Apple had an ad campaign before the iPod called Rip, Mix, Burn, where you would use iTunes to, to make CDs. So anyway, but eventually it really worked. iPod sales went up every quarter forever and ever and ever and ever, right? Even when from Mac only to Mac plus PC to then when iTunes shipped and the USB 2.0 shipped to the Mini to the Nano, getting better and better and better.
Well, so are you there to witness when they stop becoming just a Mac only company and they realize that this is they're an everything company?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I was there. So I was there until late 2003 when Steve got sick. We launched the iPod 2 weeks after 9/11, 2001.
Yep.
And it started to sell better. And then the Mini made it sell a lot better. And then USB 2.0 in the store made it sell even better. People forget about the Mini. They always talk about the Nano. They forget about the Mini. The Mini was the first. Before the Mini, people thought the key to the iPod was capacity, 5, 10, 20 gig, and that people who used it had giant music libraries like I did. But the Mini came in 2 and 4 gigabytes, had a little tiny hard disk in it, not a flash drive, but it was cheaper and cuter. And Steve almost canceled it twice, but it was a huge hit. So when that happened, you could kind of tell that the iPod was going to be a cultural phenomenon, not just a geek device, right? And then the store happened, and then the Nano, and it's everything else, right? iTunes for Windows was a really big deal, which Steve said he would never do. And then he said he would never do it, and then he said, this is the best app on Windows.
Well, he also didn't want to do an app store for the iPhone, too, but listen, we might have to come back and circle back to this whole era. So just two more questions, and I've taken up more of your time than I already promised. All week, I've been using Grammarly to write this show, as I've told you, and all week, I've been telling you should be using Grammarly in your work, no matter what that work is. Because Grammarly Premium's advanced tone suggestions can help you communicate confidently and reframe your words to be more positive and productive, so you and your team can get on the same page and projects get done on time. Grammarly works where you do already. Grammarly Premium's tone suggestions take your writings in emails or decks or documents to the next level, keeping you professional as you balance being direct and friendly while finding solutions with your team. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features, advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. The right tone can move any project forward when you get it just right with Grammarly. Go to Grammarly.com/Techmeme to download and learn more about Grammarly Premium's advanced tone suggestions. That's GRAMMARLY.com/Techmeme.
You don't have to choose between better hair growth and your health. Nutrafol provides a whole-body approach for men that promotes healthier hair and overall wellness. Get ahead of thinning hair with Nutrafol's whole-body approach to hair growth. No drugs, no compromises. Nutrafol is the #1 dermatologist-recommended hair growth supplement, clinically shown to improve your hair growth, visible thickness, and visible scalp coverage. Nutrafol's hair growth supplements use physician-formulated, natural, medical-grade ingredients. Go to Nutrafol.com to take their hair health wellness quiz. Identify causes of your thinning hair, and Nutrafol will give you a personalized plan for better hair growth through whole-body wellness. Nutrafol supports healthy hair growth from within by targeting root causes of thinning, such as stress, hormones, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and metabolism through whole body health. And it works. In a clinical study, men showed progressive improvement in hair growth and visible thickness after 3 to 6 months. Take the first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month's subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com/men and enter promo code RIDE. Find out why over 3,500 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men, spelled Nutrafol.com/men, and enter promo code RIDE. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code RIDE.
You've worked with, you more than most people. You've worked under Bill Gates, you've worked under Steve Jobs, you've worked with Rob Glazer for years. Rob's been on the show. I'm wondering if this is...
I still work with Rob.
Right. So I'm wondering, and this is my worst sort of softball magazine-style question, but I'm wondering if there's one thing that you see in good entrepreneurs, like if there's one sort of like skill set or trait or anything like that about truly great entrepreneurs, since you've worked with so many.
It's hard to say. Like, there's a great quote in the Brent Schlender book by Bill Gates where he goes, Brent, this book should be called the Don't Try This at Home book. He said, plenty of people have the asshole part down, not so many have the genius part down, right? So, which I think is a great quote, because Steve Jobs was a genius. Bill Gates wouldn't tell you that, but he's a genius, and most people aren't. And so most entrepreneurs have delusions of grandeur and think they're geniuses, right? And most of them aren't. And so you'll probably get feedback along the way that tells you if you are kind of genius-like or not in some way, right? Now, the other thing about people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs is they're very persistent. And so they have skills that most people don't have. One of them is persistence. Two is, and I don't know if this is true for everybody, it's certainly true for Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they really, really, really like to work. Did Steve Jobs have a lot of hobbies? I don't think so. Vegetable garden, He liked to work. On Saturday afternoon, he was doing email at home, right? He liked to work. So, people think they like to work, but most people don't like to work that much. They like to goof off, right? So, that's fine, but then you're not going to be like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, right? And then the other thing is, really persistent people do have a little bit, especially when they're young, a little bit of a capacity for self-delusion, right? Where they think something's done when it's not, and they think something's great when it's not, and they think other people's stuff isn't any good even if it is. And that's what keeps them going, because it's easy to talk yourself out of anything, right? I mean, it really is. And so there's this weird thing where you have to know exactly what your competition is up to, and at the same time think that there's no way they're as good at this stuff as you are, right? If that makes any sense, right? And so that's a thing that I would certainly say both Bill Gates and Bill Gates, they have announced Windows at the Windows on the World restaurant in New York City in the World Trade Center in 1983, okay? It didn't even ship till late 85, and it was a horrible product. Version 1, but it didn't do anything. You could play reverse eye. Like, it didn't do anything. So, but he thought it was great, right? He told you it was great. So that's sort of self-delusion. I mean, it's not like Donald Trump, but you do kind of believe in your own stuff, right? Steve would always say this stuff was, he'd say, oh, yeah, we're working on that in the lab, and he hadn't even thought about it until you mentioned it, right? He was just bullshitting you, So the ability to have credible BS, credible meaning you can't dispute it and it will eventually come true, is very important. That's not like Trump, where Trump just lies like a little kid, right? He's like, oh yeah, I didn't do that, when he did, and you can prove it, and So it's a weird thing, but most great entrepreneurs have it, right? The ability to get that something could be done, when it could be done, so might as well pretend it's done already, as opposed to just making it up like my daddy's a fireman or something.
Well,
and of course, You can't be a genius. I mean, both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs are geniuses in different ways. Steve Jobs loved the aesthetics of things. When I worked at NeXT with him, we'd go for a walk at lunchtime, and we'd just walk around the parking lot critiquing cars. We just walk around going, ugly, 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 pretty, pretty, ugly. Can't, now this doesn't work. I don't like the butt, for like an hour. It was like girl watching. We just do it for cars, right?
Well, and you've sat in on those breakfast meetings with Steve and Johnny Ive and these great design.
I used to go in the lab with Johnny Ive and Steve after lunch on Mondays. I go to Steve's staff meeting. I get a sandwich, and he and I, before we met with Avi and his team to go over Mac OS X, we'd go in the lab and hang out with Johnny. And they would go over, and I was really sleepy. I had to take a 6 a.m. flight every Monday morning to go to Apple. So I was getting up at 4:30, wolfing down coffee, going to the Seattle airport, flying to the San Jose airport, driving to Apple, sitting through a 3-hour staff meeting, and then following Steve around breathlessly. And I was dying. By 1:30, I was in a closed, hot, windowless room searching for caffeine. And Johnny and Steve would be talking about plastic extrusion. Like, dying. So we go over the iMac and the curve and the angle and the joint and the miter and all this crap. And then they'd be totally lost. And then they'd look at me and they'd go, what do you think? And I'd go, ship it, Where's the Coke machine? Yeah. So, yeah, they were really into it. I mean, like, really into it.
Okay, final question, and then I'm going to let you go. You've been too generous already. People, especially in Seattle, tend to get successful and by a sports team. You bought a sport. Do you still?
Yeah, the Professional Bowlers Association. Right,
and you and your partners still own that?
Rob and I do. We own it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess you're heavy. You're a serious bowler, or just a fan. Like even people that buy NFL team or NBA teams, can't necessarily play basketball.
I'm not that huge of a bowling fan. We thought, and we still think, that if you own the whole thing, you get to do things you can't otherwise do. That was really the thesis behind buying the bowling. Plus, it wasn't very expensive. But yeah, that was the thesis. But yeah, I'm a big sports fan, and I have, if I could afford it, I would have bought a bigger team. But no, it's fun. It's really fun.
All right, Mike Slade, thank you so much. And if you'll be willing, I will get in touch again, and we'll do another more Apple-centric episode possibly. But thanks for coming on the podcast and remembering all that for us.
You bet. No problem. My pleasure.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.